I'm Tony Lockwood, founder of Thompson Wright Partners, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest episode of Inside Track, where I discuss business transformation journeys with leading figures in industry. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dani Bacon. After a career that spans the private sector, the public sector, and the non-for-profit sector, she has significant experience of taking organisations on the journey to a transformed state. More recently, she has set up a consultancy focused upon people-driven change, which she will explain more about as we progress through the pod. Let me introduce you to Dani now.
Okay, morning, Dani.
Morning.
Welcome to the Inside Track podcast. It's great to have you here.
Lovely to be here.
Let's start like we always do by introducing yourself, letting the listeners know a little bit more about your background, and that sort of vital question, how you first moved into the world of change and transformation.
Okay. So, yeah, thanks for inviting me on to talk to you. Really looking forward to it. So, a bit about me. So, I've been working as an organisational development consultant for the last couple of years, initially on my own, but then last year I teamed up with my now business partner, a guy called Garen, to form a consultancy organisation called Distinction. So, we'd worked together on doing a podcast of our own, actually, on leadership and management and all that sort of thing. Then we collaborated on a couple of projects, and then kind of the natural progression, we've now set up our own company together and formed, kind of doing all our work under that new brand. So it's quite exciting. So we take a kind of really people-centric approach to the work that we do, really about helping organisations, I guess, navigate change and growth and bring out the best in their people and their teams. So we do a mix of consultancy work, training and coaching. Are also partway through writing a book on decision making. So keeping ourselves busy. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so in terms
what about earlier in your career?
Earlier in my career, yeah. So I started my I've not really had a defined career path, I guess. It's kind of been a bit emergent and driven by just doing interesting work. Am I learning? Am I enjoying myself? Am I making a difference? I really like turning vague things into reality. So if you give me a vague thing, I'll just make it happen. So I started off in the water industry actually a few years after it had been privatised. So right. I did my first 7 years stint there, kind of navigating what privatisation meant for the industry. So that was a variety of roles. Worked as a manager in a call centre, which was kind of baptism of fire in terms of managing a team for the first time. And I ended up in the buying department negotiating contracts for kind of all sorts of things, kind of some glamorous like international travel, others less so like sewer jetting. So I then migrated across to the public sector. So I worked for a number of arm's length public bodies, kind of quangos, and they were all focused on transforming the way employers were involved in the skills and employment issues across the UK. So it was essentially, that was where I got into change management, project management, really a series of roles, making change happen. So including one of them was getting a £40 million growth and innovation fund off the ground. So there was a line in I think one of the kind of budgets that said we were launching a growth and innovation fund, and then that was it, and we had to kind of sit around and make it happen, make sense of it, and work out how to get employers to put forward proposals, and they were co-investing, so the government would put in money, and then employers would put in money as well. So that was really interesting. And then by this weird quirk of fate, Investors in People, which at the time was a government-owned organisation, moved into the organisation I was working at that time as a standalone business unit. So historically, it relied on government grant funding to do what it did, which was essentially accrediting good people management practices in organisations. But it got to a point where what it was doing wasn't really strongly aligned with any current government policy objectives. So nobody really knew what to do with it. They were like, oh, it's doing good stuff. And it's got tens of thousands of kind of people who are signed up to the standard, but we don't know what to do with it. So I joined a small leadership team to lead it through its next phase. So initially that was about eliminating its reliance on public funding. So we overhauled the franchise arrangements and pricing models and streamlined processes, and then kind of set about determining what happened next to it. So ultimately it was decided to set it up as a community interest company, so a not-for-profit. And we could probably spend a whole podcast talking about that process, which took 18 months all told. But essentially, we managed the organisations through that transformation. So moving out of government, setting it up as an independent entity. And it was a bit like running a kind of startup from a back office perspective. So you've got this whole established legacy business going on, customers trying to make sure they don't know don't notice any changes. But in the back office, new finance system, new bank accounts, new credit cards, we were putting things like our team Office 365 descriptions on our own credit cards to start with, because there was nothing, there was nothing there. We were really streamlined in terms of headcount, because there'd been this massive recruitment freeze while government deciding what to happen. They didn't, well, you can't take on any more people. And it was just a fairly brutal process, I think, of leaving the public sector. It's like this cliff edge. It's like, as of tomorrow, you're not in the public sector anymore. But equally, you can't spend any money until you're out of the public sector. So it was this real cliff edge of, wasn't a gentle transition, let's say. They even kicked us out of our offices because we were in a public building. They went, no, you're out. You can't stay here. You're not a public sector building anymore. So,
but sometimes that's really good, isn't it? I think that sort of then you've got to do stuff, and you haven't got a massive team behind you. You've just got to make it happen. And I think that startup sort of philosophy and approach. I've certainly been involved in a few of those, and I just find them really, really exciting times of life. And you look back and you think, made a difference there. Yeah,
that sense of freedom of not, just getting out of the constraints of being in the public sector and having all that choice about what we do. It comes with risks, and freedom doesn't come without its challenges. But it was a really, really interesting project to be part of. As well as all the practicalities, the whole culture transformation as well, taking a team of people that some of them have been in the public sector for a really long time, and we're used to being part of that big machinery. So brilliant. So I stayed there kind of 6 years, I guess, the last few years as director of people, and I guess that's what's led me to do what I do now, which is, as I said, that people element of organisational growth and change and transformation. So
brilliant. Well, I'm sure that experience, certainly of that transition from public sector to not for profit, will inform a lot of the conversation that we're going to have later. So
I'm sure it will do.
Let's keep that to later. We ask the question to every guest. How do you define transformation?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation, kind of question. And you see that word transformation bandied about so much that everybody's doing a transformation project, and people just use it interchangeably with change and optimization, and they don't really distinguish between the two. I think for me, there's something about scale. So for me, transformation has enterprise-wide implications. So it's not just about optimizing something, it's about significant change. It's like a fundamental shift in what the organization does or what it delivers, its business model, how it's performing, how it does its reinvention, really, I guess. I think there's something about uncertainty that's attached to transformation. So for me, it's definitely in the gray zone. If you're doing something at scale that's radical, then inevitably you can't have all the answers. And if you do, you're probably not being kind of ambitious enough. I don't know. You can't predict how things are going to pan out. You can't predict, if it's going to take a long time, there's that internal, external change that you can't predict. And I think it's easy to be sucked into thinking transformation's linear, because when you look back at a project, you go, well, we went from A, we went to B. So that was what we did, but you forget kind of all the diversions and
all the wiggly lines,
or the backwards and the spiraling round. So I also think it's personal. I think it's easy to think about transformation as big programs, but for me, and I guess that comes from what I do in terms of the people side of things, I think it's down to individuals that make it happen at the end of the day. It's about individuals changing what they do, their mindsets, their attitudes, their skills, their capabilities. You need individuals to transform and change if you're going to make the wider change happen, I guess.
I agree. So on your LinkedIn profile, Dani, you say that you work with leaders to develop strategies that allow them to create the conditions, culture, structures, and processes that unleash the potential of their people to achieve great things. So tell me more about that, because I think that's every person in whatever organisation will be keen to understand how you do that.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to say. I think it's much harder to do. And I think you talk to a lot of organisations and leaders, and they say, "Oh, we're people centric, we're people first." But when you get into it, not really. It's a bit of a, we've put it on our values. So we start with a people first perspective. We advocate for involving people in change right up front. So it's not about doing change and transformation to them. It's getting involved right up front, making the best of.
How do you do that? What sort of things do you do to get them involved up front?
I think a lot of it's about creating dialogue. It's about creating a safe space for people to be involved as well. Psychological safety gets talked about a lot. There's so much collective intelligence in our teams, in our people that work in our organisations. and we need to harness that and we need to leverage it. But you're only going to do that if people feel they're safe to speak up, they're safe to share, that their ideas are going to be listened to. So a lot of the work that we do is about creating space for dialogue that wouldn't happen normally, about creating psychologically safe spaces for people to come forward and speak up. We do a really interesting exercise with some teams called the team question bank. So when you get in an organisation and they haven't had that history of asking questions or being used to challenging each other, we get them to create a team question bank. So they come up with a set of questions they're going to ask each other about every project or every initiative, just to get them used to the idea of talking to each other and asking questions. And they know they've got this set of maybe 10 or 12 questions that they will ask every time there's a project or a decision that's coming up. So and that works really well, and it kind of unlocks that reluctance, I guess, to speak up, and people know it's okay to ask these questions.
It gives them permission almost.
Gives them permission. Yeah, sometimes people need permission. However good your culture is, you don't know what people's backgrounds are. So they might have come from an organisation where you just did not challenge or question because there were consequences.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I say all the time that when you bring an external in to an organisation, especially if you bring someone in from outside of sector, they can get to the core issue really, really quickly because they ask all the numpty questions.
Yes.
But nobody will ask if you've been in that environment for many, many years. But if you set that up and give them permission to ask those numpty questions, you can unravel lots and lots of issues and challenges, can't you? Really quickly. You really just have to take the layers off.
Yeah, there's real value in having somebody stepping in from outside who isn't embroiled in all the history and the way things are done, and can, as you say, ask those numpty questions that get you to the nub of it, really. So,
but like I say, but I think that idea that you're just saying there about having that question bank and giving them permission, you're almost saying we want you to come in and ask those numpty questions.
Yeah. The other tool we use that works really well is something called the spectrum of support. So you might have seen this in my LinkedIn post. I think you commented. It's the idea about giving people more options than just yes or no when they're discussing something. So often people go, no, I'm not on board with that, or yes, I am. We give people like this spectrum of different ways of agreeing or disagreeing with what's being said. And again, that just opens up the question, opens up the discussion. You're not shutting it down into a binary yes or no. You give people space to say, yes, but I'm not sure about this bit, or I need more about this bit. So you're playing in those shades of grey. You are, absolutely, and that's life, isn't it? It's very easy to want to make it black and white, but it rarely is.
No, absolutely. So as we know, as you say, transformation, usually significant, usually by definition transformative, moving from one state to another. And because of that, it can take a long time, multi years in many instances, which can create challenges, I find, to keep people motivated, to keep them on board, to keep the executive all aligned down the one channel. So what do you do, and what experience have you had? And I'd be very surprised if you didn't have lots of examples from the public sector where the politics get into play a lot more. But what experience have you had of taking people and maintaining that absolute clear focus that's required to deliver major transformation?
I think the Investors in People journey out of the public sector is a really good example of that. So it took 18 months. So we said to the team at the start of the 18 months, there's changes coming, but we don't know what it is. And that lasted for probably 15 of those 18 months. I think in 1 week we had, there were a lot of the stakeholder landscape was really complex. It was UK wide, so there were Scottish, Welsh, Northern Ireland, English, Cabinet Office, Treasury, education, business, really complex landscape to try and navigate through. So we were saying to our team, something's happening, we don't know what it is. In 1 week, I think one day investors were being moved to another non-departmental public body. The next day it was, we might just put it out for sale to the private market. There's people out there. We might just merge it into a existing government department, so that it, and that was in the space of 3 days. So there was a lot of uncertainty. So I think for us, great communications and a regular cadence of just keeping people up to date with what's going on, even if it wasn't much, even if there wasn't new information, just keeping going with that, because actually, what humans are like, we like to make sense of stuff, and if we don't have any information, we sense make, we fill in the gaps ourselves, and we come up inevitably with a kind of worst case scenario. So that was important. Creating space for dialogue, I guess, giving people the time to really talk through what their concerns were, what their fears was, what it meant for them. I think we used line managers, were a really important resource, and making sure they felt empowered and resourced to work with their teams as well. That cohort of middle managers can be really, really important when you're working on change, because they're dealing with people day in, day out. So
and it's interesting, isn't it? I find that all too often that middle management, I wouldn't say it's forgotten, that if you don't get them on board early enough, they can become a major stumbling block. And a lot of focus is on the sponsors and the key senior stakeholders, and then the frontline staff. But actually, the enablers are those middle managers, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really important to work with them and give them just the tools and the information, so they're not on the back foot when the teams are asking the questions, and they don't throw their hands up and go, "Well, I haven't got any idea. Go and ask, someone else." I think networks are really important. So, what networks can you create in your organisation just to catalyse change and keep people enthusiastic and up and running? That's worked really well. Kind of not, I suppose it partly is transformation, but I've done a lot of work in the wellbeing space as well. So networks of wellbeing champions, and getting people to think about how they can support wellbeing in the organisation. And I think that's a really important thing when you've got a long transformation as well, is looking after people's wellbeing, keeping an eye on it. It's tiring.
As you said earlier, change only happens through the people, doesn't it? You can change the technology, you can change the processes, you can try to change the culture, but actually, if you don't really engage and people embrace that change, nothing happens. So, and during that process, the ability to look after your people and take them on that journey is a key driver of success.
Yeah. I mean, there's loads of research out there about how important things like autonomy and control and being involved in decision making are for people's well-being, and that's the sort of thing that can be lost a bit when there's a big transformation going on. People can suddenly feel like they're out of control. So, the more you can make people feel involved, then the better it is for your program and the individuals. So, and I think you said it earlier. The other thing is active senior commitment and involvement throughout the way. How often do you see somebody and a senior leader really excited at the start of the program, and then they've moved on to the next thing before you've kind of got part way through. So
what do you do to do that then? Because I agree. I think it's a challenge, because like you say, they pop up and announce it with the big fanfare, and then you never hear from them again. And then I've been in organisations and done a lot of work in sort of those public sector organisations that moved into private sector during privatisation. And a lot of the time, the culture was, well, if we keep our head down long enough, the initiative will go away and something else will crop up. And that had built up over so many years. That had become the culture. So trying to drive stuff in was really difficult, because their view was, it's not going to happen. So move on and let's wait for the next one.
And I think that's right. I mean, in an ideal world, you do a lot of work up front to work out whether the senior leaders have really are they ready for the change and the transformation that's coming, if they really understood what they're signed up for, because sometimes they like the idea of it, but they've not really realized what's involved. I think getting commitments from them in terms of how they're going to be involved throughout the process is really important. So it's more than just nominal sponsorship, isn't it? You want them to, they just need to be actively involved throughout the way, leading comms at key points, leading networks, say working with line managers, and being there to celebrate the successes along the way as well. So for me, it's about celebrating the small wins throughout the program rather than leaving it till the end. So people can see there's a reason to be engaged in this, because there are things happening already. But
I think it's a core role, isn't it, of that sort of transformation leader or that transformation director to manage up and not just report up to the sponsors, but actually manage up and make sure that they are actively engaged and actively involved and almost to some extent do what we ask them to do at the point that we ask them to do it. And that's a matter of trust then, isn't it? Because I'm not going to ask you to do everything every week. But when I do ask you to do it, I'm asking you because it's important and
Yes.
there's a real need for it.
Yeah.
So that takes some time to build that trust up.
Yeah, and I guess it's keeping the change relevant for people as well. So everything changes so quickly, doesn't it? That the case you had at the beginning might feel different as the environment and things have moved along the way. So just kind of keeping up to date and doing that scanning thing where are we still doing the right thing? Are we still doing it in the right way? Is it still meeting the organisation objectives, or have they shifted in the time since we started? So.
Yeah. But I remember the very first episode that we did of this podcast in 2020. Christoph talked about focusing on outcomes, not outputs.
Okay.
So you at that in his view was, and I agree. If you focus on outcomes, they're much more generic. They're much more. They're much wider. It's more of a philosophy. We're going in this direction. This is what we want to get, where we want to be. So we want to be much more customer centric. Where in the past you might have said, well, customer centricity is X, Y, Z. Well, if we don't meet X, Y, Z, we haven't got some customer centricity. But over a 3 or 4 year period, transformation program, new stuff could have happened. Yeah. So actually, focus upon how we will measure that customer centricity rather than focusing upon we will have A, B, and C in place. Because A, B, and C might not be relevant anymore.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It enables people to be more creative as well. They don't get hooked on a solution or an output they want to achieve. And when we've been looking at the decision-making research for the book, that thing about generating options is really, really important. The more, so many, I think it's something, I can't remember the exact stat, it's something like 75% of strategic decisions binary. So it's, do we do A or B? If you can add in just one extra option, then the failure rate of transformation and change goes down dramatically. So, and I think focusing on outcomes really frees people up to do that, to think about different options for achieving the outcome rather than looking at a kind of narrow solution.
Yeah. And I think being clear about the outcome and having that sort of North Star and that real sort of vision is great. Probably an essential of any successful transformation. But the more defined you get down to the granular level, that can, as we've said, that can prevent actually achieving of that North Star moment. So,
I think you're right. That clear vision, that objective is really important, but not to overly define it, because that contains and restrains and restricts people, doesn't it? Yeah.
So you touched on it earlier when we're talking about the sort of transition that you went through from sort of public sector into non-for-profit. That and you started to talk about some of the daily changes that were happening. Are we going private? Are we being sold? Are we going into another public body, etc.? For the people that were operating within that business unit, it must have been very, very stressful for them.
Oh, hugely, yeah.
Because fundamentally they're saying, well, what does it mean to me? Yeah. And then the following day, well, that's completely. What does that mean to me? So all that uncertainty. What did you do to sort of mitigate some of that stress and I suppose also, what do you do personally to mitigate stress when you're in that sort of environment, that environment of unknown, I suppose? And
I think partly it was about treating people like adults, so not covering up the fact that we didn't know, being really quite transparent about the uncertainty. It was about helping people work through what it might mean for them and how they felt about that, and having some options lined up. We put in a whole program around well-being to give people kind of the tools and techniques to manage their own stress and their own well-being. So that went down really well, and that was really directed by the team. The kind of what are the things that are going to really help you kind of navigate this. So I mean, in terms of me personally, so I've done quite a lot. I'm a big advocate of well-being. It's been a really important part of the work that I do, and have done and still do. So I make it a real priority. I think as a leader, it's about role modeling. So you're not saying one thing and doing another. So, when the pandemic hit, I would, and I was homeschooling my son, and, there was a lot going on. I took an hour out at lunchtime every day, irrespective of what going on. We went out for a walk, and I just made sure my team knew that. It's like, it's okay to do that. If it's too much, take a break. So really kind of doing that, I think, making sure that people feel they can trust you, and they can talk about their own mental health and their well-being. So creating an environment where people will open up and talk to you, because then you can do something about it. It's not about becoming a therapist. It's about being able to signpost people to the right sort of help. For me, it's been a lot of self-awareness about what are my triggers. When do I know I'm getting stressed? Spotting it early before it kind of takes a hold, and then doing things I know are going to help. For me, it's like taking kind of 2-minute pauses in a really busy day just to kind of regroup, reground before I move on to the next thing. And then just making sure I've got a real work-life balance, which is a bit of a cliche. It doesn't have to be big stuff, but out myself as a complete geek here. So Lego is my thing at the moment. So I've spent years being Lego assistant to my son. He's grown up a bit and he's not so keen on Lego now, but I'm doing Lego on my own now. So it's, some of the more the kind of bigger builds, I'm just really enjoying doing that. It's kind of like a really mindful thing. And fun.
It's really interesting. I was talking to someone the other day. I'm just desperately trying to remember who it was, but they were saying exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
That that sort of having all of these different building blocks and having a picture of what they've got to create and working out, it just takes you away from everything else, and you just focus upon one thing and one thing only, and it switches them off, and it just gives them that opportunity just to refresh themselves almost. But I think the other thing you mentioned there, which is very common, of just getting out into nature, going for a walk, going for a run, going for a cycle, whatever. But just getting out and getting fresh air and just giving yourself a bit of time is a consistent theme that's come through.
Absolutely. I think it's really easy, isn't it, when we're all working from home and we're stuck behind Zoom screens, just to head down and not do that. But it does make a massive difference. Like you speak to lots of people who find that there's real kind of power and goodness in doing that.
Yeah, and some people, just go for a walk and take in the environment. I tend to go for a walk and listen to podcasts, but listening to sort of completely, different types of podcasts, because it's just it takes you away from what you're doing, and you're just absorbing more and more information out of which I find that quite relaxing. But other people, I say, just need to have quiet space, don't they? Just get out and not have anything. So whatever works for you is the key message, isn't it?
Know what works for you and make sure you do it, which is easier said than done, but
okay, so another question that I like to ask is that ultimately we've all heard these sort of dreadful statistics about change programs, transformations failing, and okay, they might not have been delivered on time or within budget, or might have not have delivered the full value, but most of them will deliver the necessary change, in my experience. But a key driver of that time is often about the value that's delivered. So what do you do? What have you done to ensure that sort of value stream, that sort of focus upon the value delivery, is maintained as you go through these sort of 18-month, 24-month change initiatives?
It's a good question. I think it's having it front of mind all the time. So keeping it refreshed. So just making sure that whatever you're delivering is still delivering value in the context the organization is in at the time you're working with it, because things change, especially now. Things change so quickly. I think it's just checking in all the time and not setting off on a direction and being dogmatic about, well, we said we're doing it for the next 18, 24 months and we'll check in at the end of it. It's just that constant recalibration and nudging as you go along. If you can kind of measure quick wins or kind of early successes, are there markers we can put along the way to help us track what's successful and what's not? Again, talk to people. What are they feeling? I think this whole thing about resistance to change really interests me. So this idea that people are resistant to change and we need to stop that and quash it. For me, they're like the people who are willing to stand up and go, I'm not on board here. I'm not sure about this. They're like your early warning system. Because if they're speaking up, there's probably another 10 people behind them who are just heads down going, well, I'm not going to say anything, but think this is a terrible idea. So use the people around you. Your collective intelligence. Is this going to deliver the thing that we think it's going to deliver? Is it really delivering value? What are the obstacles? What are we not seeing?
And like you say, if you can spot those people early doors and work, and work with them and turn them around, often they become the biggest advocates of the initiative and of the program. And as you say, they take people with them. And so they will become the champions of the change.
Absolutely.
And if they don't, it's better that you know about them, because they go take a group of people with them as well.
If you haven't got any of those, I'd be suspicious.
Absolutely. Because at least once you've identified them, you can take action and do something. But just by remaining completely blinkered, it's just going to come up and trip you up at some point in the future, isn't it?
I mean, the other thing for me around delivering value is good decision making. I've become kind of really advocate for good decision making the more we've kind of done the research for the book. I think it's all the way along weighing up your options. Are we taking the best option that's going to add most value at this point, and not rushing through the tensions or the difficulties just because you want to get over the awkwardness and rush into a kind of convergence. So just managing the tensions and the conflicts well along the way. So you're really making sure that the thing you're coming up with is the thing that's going to add most value, and not just something that adds some value.
What are you finding at the moment in terms of organisations and their approach to going back into the office or going back to pre-COVID ways of working, when people have become more accustomed to working in that much more flexible environment? What are you finding over the last few weeks and months as things start to change?
I think it's a real mixed bag. So you've got some organisations that have just gone, right, we're just going back to the office, everybody in, and they're making very knee-jerk decisions. And it might be everybody's in, we're in the office 3 days, you can work from home 2 days a week. You've got others who are kind of taking a more pragmatic approach, I guess, looking at what's worked well for people. What are the challenges, and they're trying to work, okay, how do we keep the stuff that's worked really well for people and carry that forward. So I think it's starting with the right question, isn't it, around that whole hybrid solution? What's going to enable our people to do their best work for the organisation? So if you start with the right question, then you kind of get into the how do we make that happen, rather than is it 2 days in the office or is it 3? So there's some people who are engaged in that and others who are just desperate to go back to the way it was. But I think for many people, it's just a different world now. And you're not, I think ultimately you're going to restrict the type of people who want to come and work for you if you're overly dogmatic about bringing people back to an inflexible 9-to-5 office-based role, when actually the business case isn't there necessarily, and people can see it's worked for 18 months or 2 years. I've been talking to a couple of organisations recently. One decided very early on that we're all back in the office 5 days a week. That's what we're going to do. And that was I don't know whether you call them a quango, but certainly a related to public sector. And another one, which was a non-for-profit, said, actually, we're selling our head office. Everyone's working from home. So literally two extremes. And both of them have lost really, really good people. This is the problem, isn't it? If you go to the extremes, there's not one solution that fit. I think this whole hybrid thing is really, we've talked about workplaces and the employee experience becoming more and more personalised, and that thing about where you work is almost like the ultimate extension of personalising the employee experience. And it's how you navigate that. What do we need to do to keep the best talent, keep people engaged, keep people motivated, but also enable us to still deliver our kind of corporate objectives or organizations, deliver on our organization's purpose. So I think for me, if as a leader you can set some, as we talked about high level outcomes, what are the things that we need to deliver as an organization? So set those and then give people the freedom to work out how to do it. And if you need more collaboration, then be creative about that. You've got some organizations that are completely remote that bring their people together a couple of times a year for a kind of big social event. There's some great tools that you can use for collaboration that aren't made the most of at the moment. So it's upping your own kind of virtual collaboration skills as a leader, and encouraging your team to do that as well. So there's all
And
sorts of ways.
It's interesting, and I think it's two ways, because as individuals, you need to be open to, absolutely take advantage if you can work from home, and if the organisation allows you to do that, to have that flexibility. But also remember that at some times it just won't work for you to conduct workshops through Zoom or Teams. You do need to physically be in the same room. So as individuals, you need to have that flexibility as well. And I think if the organisation, the management, and the individuals have that open approach, that will be really, really powerful moving forward.
Really, really powerful. I think it's having clarity on that as well, so that you don't get people joining an organisation expecting one thing and then finding out it's different, because that's when you get the real problems, when there's that big disconnect between expectations and reality. So if you're open with people and say, if you work here, then that probably means you're going to be in the office, for some of the time, and you can work from home some of the time. That's great. People know what they're getting into. But equally, there's people who hate working from home. So, if your environment is fully virtual, you need to be upfront with people, because some people just go, that is like my idea of hell.
Well, I remember I delivered my consulting through a professional services firm, Gunnar Cook, and there's about 300 partners. And I remember having a conversation with a big part of it is a law firm, and I was having a conversation with one of the lawyers very early on in lockdown one, when literally everybody was locked down, wasn't it? And she's like, I hate the mate of it. She says, I live on my own. I've got a 1-bedroom flat in East London. It's just dreadful, and that well-being and that mental health had a major impact upon it. She's really, really focused, very successful, but that ability to not leave the confines of a 1-bedroom flat in East London had a massive impact on her. And
that's why, as a leader, it's really important you know your teams, and you know your people as individuals, so you know who's going to thrive in which environments, and who's going to find a particular situation really difficult, and then you can help them work with it.
And that comes back to your comment on LinkedIn, isn't it? To create the conditions, cultures, structures, and processes. Brilliant. So we end these with a common question. So if you had to really just focus upon one thing, what would that be? What's the one takeaway that you think is the non-negotiable in terms of driving change and transformation within organizations?
This probably won't be a major surprise, but I think it's about putting people in the driving seat and putting people first. I guess part of my mission is to stop leaders paying lip service to saying that. So really, really put people in the driving seat, co-create with them, involve them from the off, and be as creative and find as many ways as you can do that. And I think don't buy into the idea it slows the process down. I think it's just different phasing. You either put the effort in up front in involving people, or you're dealing with consequences not having done that later down the track. So put people first.
There's a phrase, isn't there? It might slow the start.
Yes.
But it will speed up the end almost. And that's not the quote, but it's something along those lines.
The sentiment of it. Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Dani. I'm really appreciative of you coming on today. We occasionally get some questions. So if I collate them, are you happy to take questions and engage with people directly?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely fine, Tony. No worries.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Okay. Cheers. Thank you.
Dani, thank you so much for joining me today. There's so many things that we have covered that are relevant to organisations and people undergoing change and transformation right now. As Dani mentioned, she has recently launched her own consultancy. If you have the desire to follow her footsteps, as part of the Transformation Leaders Hub, we have created a 22-question assessment that will help you to identify those areas that will require focus to ensure that you can successfully pivot your career in this way. So check out the link in the show notes and take advantage of the assessment right now. We will be back in a couple of weeks' time with our 50th episode. In most of the previous shows, we have discussed the potential impact of change on stress levels. The guy that I have on the next show believes passionately that change shouldn't be stressful, and he will share his experiences and actions taken to ensure that this is the case. So, see you in a couple of weeks.